Welcome to the Baptist broadcast. Why am I not a Paedobaptist? Let me give a couple of reasons, a couple of initial reasons, and I don't want to come off as if I am answering this question in an exhaustive or sufficient manner. I'm giving initial responses for why, or to the question, why are you not a Paedobaptist? The first reason, one of the first and foremost reasons, is that there is no express commandment or example in the New Testament for baptizing infants. That's my first reason. And the Paedobaptist rolls their eyes and says, "Oh, we've heard this so many times before. That's a non-starter." And the reason they think it's a non-starter is because of, in the case of Reformed Paedobaptists, because of their antecedent or more fundamental version of covenant theology. And we can get into that here in a little bit. But they'll say, well, goodness, we've heard that before. You guys have always said that. But the reality is, Josh, that first century Christians would have been assuming, especially first century Jewish converts, would have been assuming that their children would be brought into the new covenant just like their children would be brought into the old covenant. Their children, after all, were brought into the old covenant through birth, and then they had the covenant sign given to them at the 8th day of birth, or at the 8th day of life, which was circumcision, right? Circumcision of the flesh. We see that instituted in Genesis 17, and it's really governed and controlled by the Mosaic covenant, what we would say the apex or the top of, or the full development of the old covenant there in Moses. And they would say, well, since that's the case, that was just the normal assumption that the children would be brought into the covenant that were born to, Israelite parents. And so too, in Christianity, with the advent of the new covenant, the establishment or inauguration of the new covenant, so too they would just have assumed that principle, that genealogical principle, would carry over. So if someone was born to Christian parents, right, they would be baptized, which is the antitypical fulfillment of circumcision, sometime in their infancy. They're usually not very stringent about, when to baptize. Maybe it's not on the 8th day per se, but sometime in their infancy they're baptized. They're given the covenant sign and seal of the covenant of grace, which is baptism under the new covenant administration. And I say, well, yeah, that's a good argument. In fact, that's probably one of the best arguments that they have, that this would have been assumed as a principle in the transition between the old covenant to the new covenant. Well, children were brought in then, so it would have just been assumed. In other words, the new covenant or the New Testament wouldn't have needed to teach it, because it would have just been assumed and carried over from the Old Testament. And so I would say, yeah, that's a pretty powerful argument. However, you are committing subtly the fallacy of question begging, which is the petitio principii fallacy. And the reason you are begging the question is because you have a more fundamental covenant theology that you're not arguing for. You're assuming it, and then you're assuming that everyone in the first century would have believed that same conception of covenant theology that you do. In other words, it's like you were saying, you are already beginning with the conclusion of your argument, right? You are already beginning with what you want to get to in your argumentation. You're already beginning with the assumption that the old covenant really just is the covenant of grace. It was just the administration of the covenant of grace prior to the new covenant, and that the new covenant is just a new administration of that self-same covenant, of the covenant of grace. So you have the covenant of grace, right, which is the actual covenant that is administered in both old and new covenants, okay? And so you have the old covenant administration of the covenant of grace and the new covenant administration of the covenant of grace. And they are assuming that model of covenant theology and imposing that upon first century Christians, saying that, well, since they would have assumed that basically this is what's going on, that the new covenant is just an administration of the covenant of grace, which is really all the old covenant was as well, then it's a no-brainer. Of course they would have been assuming that we treat our children the same way we treated our children under that older covenant, right? Because it's the same covenant after all. Well, I would say to that, hear me out. The new covenant is substantially a different covenant from the old covenant. They're different covenants. And if the people in the first century, if the new converts in the first century were assuming that, in other words, if they were assuming that, not that the new covenant was just an administration, a different administration than that of the old covenant, but part of the self-same covenant. But if they believed that the new covenant was actually a substantially different covenant than the old covenant, they would not have automatically assumed that they just need to bring their children into the new covenant like they did in the old covenant through circumcision, right? They would not have just assumed that baptism was an antitypical fulfillment of circumcision and so would have carried over in terms of the age range that it was to be administered to and all of that. They would have not assumed that. This is a substantially different covenant. And so if they would have assumed that it was a different covenant, then they would have just been asking the question, okay, what's the new covenant? And that we find ample revelation for, right? We find what the new covenant is all through the New Testament. And even in the Old Testament, we find what the new covenant is and what it's going to be. For example, Jeremiah 31 through 34. The earliest glimmerings of it is in Genesis 3, right? So, and then, of course, all through the New Covenant itself, or the New Testament itself, we find out what the New Covenant is. And so if the Christians in the first century would have just been assuming that this was the same administration or a different administration of the same covenant, of which the old covenant was a part of as well, then of course maybe a natural impulse would just be to bring their children in, just like they were doing under the old covenant. But if they were assuming that the new covenant indeed was a substantially different covenant, then they would just been asking the question, well, what is the new covenant? Because they understood then, one thing they would have been understanding or presupposing is that when God makes a covenant, that the terms of the covenant are given as well. And so they would have been asking, well, what are the terms of the covenant? What is this covenant? So the Reformed Paedobaptists especially are assuming something rather than arguing for it, namely, that the people in the first century would have been assuming that they should bring their infants into the new covenant, because after all, the new covenant just is an administration of that covenant of grace. That is a claim to be proven. That is an assumption to be proven, and is usually not proven when that argument is made. And it is a good argument, of course, if that is assumed, right? If the covenant of grace is just administered in two different ways, between the old covenant and the new covenant, then maybe, yeah, it would be rational to think that, well, that's the same thing. The age range doesn't change, right? So we need to bring our children in through the new covenant sign, which is baptism. The other thing is, and I've been criticized for this in the past. I don't ever try to prove Baptist theology, at least Baptist theology as we know and love it today, from church history. And the reason is because it's actually quite hard, especially when you go into the earlier centuries of the church, to find Baptist theology. In fact, I would say within the first 3 centuries of church history, it's impossible to find it. If you're talking about post-canonical extant literature, okay, it's impossible to find it. But one of the things I would say, and one of the reasons I'm just not so easily persuaded by the Paedobaptist argument, at least in terms of historical theology, is because in those first 3 centuries of the church, it's an eclectic approach to baptism. It's an eclectic approach. Nobody can take the historical high ground. And I think that's a very significant point to make. And even Gerhardus Voss admits that, hey, there's a deafening silence here in terms of our, doctrine of baptism, and we should acknowledge that. He said, He says let's see, it's the fifth volume. It's his volume on ecclesiology, Reformed dogmatics. He says, here too, weight must be given to the fact that the church fathers tell us nothing about the time when young people in the church should be baptized. That would have been necessary if infant baptism had been totally absent. Okay, so he's trying to make an argument off of an assumption for infant baptism based on the silence of what is going on in those first 3 centuries. But he acknowledges the silence, right? And that's important. He acknowledges the silence. He acknowledges the eclecticism as well earlier on under that same question heading, question 27 in the chapter on baptism. So it's really important to understand here that when you look at the witness of the first 3 centuries of the post-canonical extant literature of the church, that you do not find any one position universally advocated in terms of baptism. You could even get rid of credo baptism. Our position, right? You could get rid of that and set that aside and say, what about paedobaptism? Is there an agreed upon idea of what baptism is among the Paedobaptists, among the infant Baptists that are present in like the 3rd century, for example? And the answer to that is no. Like, for example, in 2 Clement, you have a baptism that needs to be protected by you. You have to work to protect your baptism because it's something that is in risk of being spotted by your sin. And then in Ignatius to Polycarp, baptism is something that protects you. Okay, so, and that was always something that was kind of in conversation. What's the function of baptism? Baptismal regeneration is really, if you're talking about just the Paedobaptists in the earlier church, baptismal regeneration really is the norm. And so that really precludes the Reformed Paedobaptists from making any sort of historical argument during that time frame. In fact, their version of baptism, that baptism is a sign of and seal of the new covenant, and that in fact the infant is to be given baptism on that basis and not on the basis of baptismal regeneration, is a novel, or it's an innovative idea. It was conceived in the 14th, probably 15th to 16th centuries, and is found hardly anywhere prior to that point. So while infant baptism, in terms of its accidents, just the appearance of infant baptism, the sprinkling of an infant or the dipping of an infant, did most certainly precede the Reformation and the post-Reformed, it was almost always construed in terms of baptismal regeneration. Okay, so the Reformers and the post-Reformed Paedobaptists are novel in the sense of their actual construal of the doctrine of baptism and what it achieves and what it's for when they deny that it's for infant regeneration. It's actually a means whereby God regenerates the person. Voss denies that that Reformed Paedobaptistic baptism is regenerative. It's not, right? It's not causally linked to the internal work of the Holy Spirit. It's a sign and seal, right? It's not the cause, instrumental or otherwise, of regeneration. So that is a notable difference between the Reformed and the post-Reformed and the historical witness. Yet the Reformed Presbyterian or the Reformed Congregationalists will stand there and they'll say, well, we are the historical position. We are of the historical consensus, and that's just not true. The reasoning for infant baptism, especially in the early church, is very different. It's substantially different from the Reformed Paedobaptistic reasoning for infant baptism. So those are just a couple of reasons why I'm not persuaded by the Paedobaptists. I'm surrounded by Paedobaptist resources, and Andrew Woolsey gives a really good account of Paedobaptistic history and covenant theology. It's like a 400 to 500 page book on the history, really the history of Reformed covenant theology, and very good, very precise, very engaging. But it's still lacking in terms of persuasive power for me. I just don't see the Paedobaptist argumentation is carrying very much weight. And that's owing to my own theological presuppositions that, worship especially must be expressly revealed by God. It must be commanded by God, and it must, or at least it must be exemplified in the pages of Holy Scripture. And it's not. Infant baptism is not. If you're thinking about the divine method, we might say, what is it? How has the church, worshipped, or why did the Israelites, for example, do what they did? They didn't just extrapolate. There was no conjecture, and when there was judgment, right? Like Nadab and Abihu. They did what they were told to do, okay? And I'm just carrying that same principle over in my hermeneutics to the new covenant. When God says do X, Y, Z, we do X, Y, Z, and we don't go beyond what is written because of an assumption or otherwise, right? So, for that reason, that's one of my presuppositions that keeps me where I am. But the lack of there being a command for infant baptism, an example of infant baptism, just kind of solidifies it in some ways. Then kind of the weakness of the Reformed Paedobaptistic argumentation in specific is kind of another reason, and I've tried to point that out just slightly here. And then the lack of historical witness to their particular position is kind of a testament to their own innovation in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Maybe if you're teeter-tottering and if you're like, I don't know if I should be a Baptist, I don't know if I should, convert to paedobaptism, I just don't have the ammunition, just stop and think. Look, I there are people like me all over the country. We're Baptist pastors, and a great many of us would say we haven't even scratched the surface yet in terms of our own theology, and getting to the bottom of it and expositing it and committing it to memory and all of that. And really being experts in it and growing in that area. We will never stop growing in that respect. So if you're out there and you're saying, well, maybe I should convert, maybe I should become a Paedobaptist and leave this Baptist stuff behind. After all, Baptist churches are so disorganized and wonky and committed to all sorts of errors and all of that. Well, there are good Baptist churches out there. There are Baptist churches out there that take Christian orthodoxy very seriously. And this is something you really should research. You really should dig in. And chances are, if you think you've come to the point where you know enough to jump ship, you probably don't know enough to jump ship. So unless you are just convinced that you think God is going to judge you for not jumping ship, then just hold on, pray. Figure it out in terms of your own theology. Do your research. Look at the historical witness. Don't get into theology debates on Facebook. That's the worst. These people say all sorts of things to get you to change your mind. And really, when you look at it yourself, you'll find a surprising amount of silence in the historical witness for the, in particular, Reformed Paedobaptist position. And you'll find a surprising amount of support, both exegetically in the scriptures, confessionally, historically. You'll find it all there for the Baptist position. So God bless you guys. Hopefully this was useful. If it was, give me a thumbs up. Appreciate that always, and subscribe to my channel. Click the when you do subscribe, please subscribe. But if you do subscribe, click the bell for continued notifications. Have a wonderful evening.